Good evening, everyone. A big thank you to all of you for making time in your schedule to attend this webinar in the wake of what we are facing today as a country, together with the rest of the world. My name is Mai Mokowe. I am the administrator of the platform Blue Connect. Today, we bring you a talk by Dr. Pax Ramela, who's going to be talking to us about a topic he terms the blind spot. As this is a webinar which depends entirely on connectivity, please expect some delays in transmission. So the voice might be ahead of the video, or the video might be ahead of the voice. The chat is on, so you are more than welcome to chat to us. Secondly, this is a reminder that this is not a CPD talk. As you would have noted, there was no mention of CPD on the advert, but rather it's an engagement aimed at sparking debate in the industry. Without taking time, allow me to introduce Dr. Pax Ramela, and he is basically the man who needs no introduction. So I'm not going to say much, but rather to allow Dr. Pax Ramela to take us through the presentation. Dr. Pax Ramela, thank you so much for taking time in your busy schedule to join us here this evening and engage the colleagues in a thought-provoking debate, I understand. Dr. Pax Ramela, sebaka ke sa gago.
Thank you very much, Maimo, and thanks to everyone that has taken the time to attend the webinar. It was actually with great difficulty that I accepted this invitation, because I had said to myself that I am never going to be, giving talks at any other stage in my life. I thought I had resigned, but I've just been pulled back into it. I suppose there are a lot of people who might want to know what I'm doing at the moment. I'm sure a lot of you know that I do some work with PPN. I'm doing this presentation in my personal capacity, so it basically has got nothing to do with my work background. I also work with a medical devices company that supplies medical devices of all sorts to the medical industry. And lastly, I'm involved with a company that is involved with gene therapy. So I chose this topic, blind spot, because I thought that, in evaluating what happens in many industries, and optometry being no exception, that there are a number of things that we basically miss, and yet they are there. So we only see the things that we want to see if we don't take extra care to look around or to question ourselves on some things. We find that we miss quite a few things. So I'm going to be talking to you about optometry. My first point is that, optometry actually basically, I think, is a profession that undermines its value. It really doesn't know what it has. Optometry does not understand what it can contribute. And it has actually, as a profession, never really sat down to think, what is it? How can we make ourselves more special than we are? Actually, it reminds me of a beggar who had previously worked in the garden. And when the prospective employers died, they left him with 3 containers. They said, that's all that we're giving you. And he was, with these containers, he sat in the street and was begging throughout his time, until someone came and dropped a coin in one of them and heard that the sound was different. And when he then inspected, why is it that this coin, the sound of the coin is so different, he found that the vase is actually lined with gold on the inside. So here sits a man, a beggar by the side of the street, who's sitting with a couple of ounces of gold with him, but he never knew, because he never really questioned a lot of the things that are happening. And that, I think, is very much similar to what we find in the profession of optometry today. So, the first blind spot that I see in optometry is our determined march to try and walk backwards. Most of our conversations, everything that we're doing, is actually linked to the past. We want to see things happen the way that they used to. We want to be able to practice the way that we used to. We want to be able to claim and do our business in the way that we used to. And unfortunately, that time is gone. One of the biggest challenges that we face as humans is that we actually learn backwards. We learn by evaluating the past, and that lesson takes place as we walk forwards. And if we are not careful, that constitutes one of the biggest blind spots that we have. The good old days are gone. And the sooner we realize that as a profession, the better it will be for us. The pre-competition era, where we could get together as optometrists and decide on various things, from pricing to structures of how we can claim and so on, those days are gone. Nothing signals the permanent nature of managed healthcare going forwards, like the national health insurance that we are facing. Because you can understand that with the national health insurance, once it does take root, we are not going to be able to demand anything and everything that we require as a health service. There are going to be specific packages that are going to be offered. We are going to have to learn for our own survival in the future to work on whatever is being offered within the confines of the rules, right? And we have got very, very little regulatory protection going forwards. If you think about it, our regulatory bodies are marching way behind where the world is going, way behind what is happening in the professions. It is difficult to, for example, to regulate against the online sales of spectacles. It is difficult to regulate against the online sale of contact lenses because there's almost hardly a way in which those things can be monitored. And therefore, if we must enjoy some regulatory protection itself needs to start looking forwards. It needs to start being different because we cannot be applying the rules of yesterday to try and govern a future which for all intents and purposes is so different from the past that we know, that unless we begin to change how we do what we do and when we do it, we are actually destined for a very heavy crash. The second blind spot, which I have a sense that is not receiving our attention, is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, in as much as we are happy that it will be able to read retinographs and many other pictures and be able to tell us whether there is a glaucoma or not. Artificial intelligence is decimating professions. I was reading an article the other day, which was basically saying that there are many health profession schools, in medicine in particular, that have started reducing the number of radiologists that they are training. Because essentially, the profession of radiology has now been taken over by artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is now able to read and report on X-rays with far more accuracy than the radiologist can do. To an extent that you don't actually even need a radiologist in every radiology practice. There are countries now where you find that the service of radiology, to a large extent, is actually outsourced to countries outside of that very country. For example, in India now, we know that there are a number of radiology practices that basically sit and analyze radiographs or corroborate the results of radiography reports that are done by artificial intelligence and give those reports a yes or a no. There are professions such as dermatology. In as much as we would have thought that dermatology requires a special skill in terms of the human eye, artificial intelligence is able to read lesions of the skin far better than dermatologists can do. And the likelihood that life will continue to be the same for dermatologists is basically nil. There are professions such as pathology, where artificial intelligence is basically reading all the slides. It is reading, if you look at blood tests, they are basically almost completely done through machines. Artificial intelligence has gone to a point where computers themselves are now writing computer programs. It has advanced to a point where there is thinking that in the next 5 to 10 years, computers will start having feelings like human beings have. Your computer will be able to relate to you like a person. The ability for speech recognition is one of the biggest game changers. I'm sure even in South Africa here, you would know that in Nedbanks, there are some branches that have robots that you can go up to and speak to, and they can respond appropriately to the questions that are being asked. Ask yourself, in the light of so much artificial intelligence, which in optometry was already signaled early in the 70s through the autorefractor, and the accuracy of those autorefractors has been progressively improving. In the next coming years, we are facing a likelihood that a patient will enter an optometry practice that is completely unmanned. That you will present your medical aid card or your credentials in whatever way that you would be doing. You will sit from your first machine to the last machine and come out with an accurate diagnosis. You would know that Essilor already has got technology which is able to read your face and come up with suggested types of frames that you can put on. And not only does it end there, we have got to a point where technology has advanced to such an extent that we are now talking about 3D printing. What is the likelihood that with the advances that we are seeing in the materials technology that is there, that there will come a point where a patient can basically go home, use their own 3D printer to produce their own frame and the lenses that have been prescribed from that practice that is unmanned. Unless we find a way of operating within these constraints and new challenges, we are going to find that the importance of our profession is going to diminish as time passes by. So, the question of relevance should actually be high up on our minds. If you look at what is happening even within managed healthcare itself, probably in most organizations, up to 85–90% of the claims actually don't even pass through the eyes of anyone because everything runs through computerized systems. So, as long as we pretend, or as long as it does not come to mind that we are actually threatened because optometry by its very nature, like many of the other professions, has got an element of repetitiveness, which is easier to copy, we might find ourselves competing with the robots. You might actually find that optometry eventually is practiced in a booth at the corner of a street, just like those booths that used to take photographs. You get in there, sit, throw your coins in there. Probably this time it will be a chip or two, and you can have your full examination in there with results without any intervention of what we know today to be an optometrist. So this is a very serious challenge to us. The past, which I referred to in blind spot number 1, is not going to be able to save us. Any effort that we are making to try and capture the semblance of the past is actually wasted energy. So what we should actually be doing is to sit and have conversations such as the one that we're having today, to ask ourselves, how do we remain relevant in the onslaught of this artificial intelligence, of this age of artificial intelligence? It is not just the health professions that are threatened by artificial intelligence. Even the software developers themselves are threatened by artificial intelligence, because now there are computer programs that are writing computer programs. We have advanced so far in our ability to be creative and developmental that we're probably all going to head to a point where we simply don't have jobs because computers have taken over. So this is a conversation that we cannot manage to avoid for too long. If our curricula are not preparing the students that are coming out of the universities for this type of challenge in future, we need to ask ourselves very, very deep questions about whether or not we will continue to have a profession, or it is just one of those ones that is going to be taken over and completely eliminated with hardly any requirement for any human intervention. Of course, that is not possible. But the thing at the end of the day is we may not need as many optometrists as we have today. And if that is the case, then where to for the entire profession? Our third blind spot is our inability to move on, which is this stagnant development that I'm talking about. There has hardly been any new things that are coming in optometry. And if there are new things, they come from everyone else other than the person that has been trained in the profession of optometry. It is the engineers and the software guys that are designing better systems to be able to read various things. And these days, as I said in blind spot number 2, if a computer can produce a report, a keratograph or any other type of report, then we're not very far from the point where it will be able to read that keratograph. In fact, we've got to that point already. So there has not been much by way of development in optometry. I mean, if you look at the binocular cross-seal test, I don't know how many years old that test is. And this is exactly what we're teaching our students as they come through university. Every other test that we have, very, very little is new. So we are basically educating our students for yesterday. When the future does not speak to the things that we teach them, and even if it does speak to them, we are finding no creative ways to make the students that are coming through to be a lot more relevant for the future than they are for today. Optometry has not developed much more than it had in the past. And in as much as we accept or we are happy that there are new changes, that we'll be able to write a prescription, writing prescriptions and knowing what to give and to know and not know the side effects is no longer the prescribed domain of professional people. In the presence of computer programs or computer advancements such as Google, people have a headache today. They can go in and say, how do I solve this headache on their computer? It can give them a list of drugs to take. They can check on what the interactions are, which drugs to take when, which drugs not to take when. By the time they approach where they can purchase drugs, where they can actually go to the pharmacist, who in himself or herself, the pharmacist, is also threatened. Because we have moved towards digital prescriptions. People no longer have the time to go to the pharmacy and stand in the queue. Those prescriptions can then be sent electronically. They will be packaged electronically. They will be sent to the booth closest to where that person is, that on their way to work, they can stop, slot in a card, get their prescription out, and leave. And that prescription will be properly labeled as to when to take the drugs 3 times, 4 times a day, before or after meals, or whatever the case might be. So the thought that we could actually survive the tsunami that is coming in technology, in the form of technology into optometry, is actually a thought that makes us comfortable at this point, but we actually should be uncomfortable. We should be associating ourselves as optometrists with other professions. We should be talking and exchanging information, finding out what are those things that we can do in the event that some of the routine things that we do are taken over. I have already spoken about artificial intelligence looking at histology slides. I'm sure we've all done histology. We know how tricky those things can be. Artificial intelligence is at a point where it can pick up small differences that are not visible to the human eye. What therefore stops artificial intelligence from actually doing a biomicroscopy examination without us and produce a report? So if we're to survive going forward, we need to be sensitive. We need to make ourselves relevant. That when any other health profession sits with a patient in front of them, they shouldn't actually be able to get to a point where they discharge that patient without having said to the patient, I would like us to get the opinion of an optometrist on your health. That is crucial. That is crucial. We need to walk ourselves in there. We have avoided for too long some of those parts of optometry that tend to be difficult. But that is where we're supposed to be going. Unless we can begin to hold hands with other professions and other people, not just in healthcare, in all the other disciplines that were not strictly healthcare, we're going to find it difficult to be comfortable in the future as optometrists. So it is important that we need to revisit how we are training our students today. It is important that we revisit some of those aspects of optometry that most people don't really care much about. That we need to start looking at them again and seeing whether or not are these not the saviors that are there for us going forward. Because I can tell you, producing a plus 050 minus 050 script is definitely a piece of cake for the kind of technology that is coming. So we need to fight for relevance. And the unfortunate part is the collaborations that I'm talking about are not just collaborations with people outside. We need to collaborate as optometrists inside of optometry. When the greatest resources sit on top of the table, where optometrists should actually be taking their place amongst professionals and cutting their piece of cake there, we sit under the table fighting for the crumbs. And that is not much to go by. We will find with time as it has already started happening, that many practices are going to close down. And as the years progress, it is going to get worse and worse and worse by the day, and until we find a way of working with one another. There is no monopoly over knowledge. And in optometry, we are still islands. We are called one profession, but we are many different professions within optometry. There are some people who are chosen authorities in various things. But we do not have, if we were a nation, I would say we do not have a national consensus that actually charts our way forward as optometrists, that positions us in terms of where do we want to be with what is coming. And unfortunately, the birth of optometry, the birth of the profession of optometry was always characterized by a difference with another profession. We were born out of the fight with ophthalmology and the medical profession. And unfortunately, that albatross has been hanging on our necks. If there is no fight, it feels like we don't have a profession. The only time we think we have a profession is when we are pointing a finger in this direction or the other. It is when we are busy creating cleavages where they are not supposed to exist. It is when we are beginning to working on creating chasms and feel comfortable that I'm so happy that I stand on this side when the other guys stand on that side. That is not going to benefit us for much beyond this point. So it is important that as we struggle to find our relevance going forward, that we must begin with one another, that we must create those things and those platforms that are going to make this profession a lot more relevant. Otherwise, we are going to be relegated to the dustbin of history because of the stagnation in the development of the profession. The last blind spot that I'm going to talk about is gene therapy. There has been so much development in the space of genetics that the human genome has almost been completely decoded into zeros and ones, just like in the digital space when you can write a program. And we at a point now where genes can be manipulated to a point where your cells as an adult can be taken and they can be re-engineered backwards into stem cells and even further backwards into gametes. A male person can actually have ovaries made out of the cells that they have as a male. Why is this still relegated to the laboratory? But the impact of that is far outreaching. We're moving to a point where there's so much that is known about our genes and how they operate, that unless we find a way of getting relevance even with those developments, we are going to find it very, very difficult to survive in the future. We've got to a point now where, because of gene therapy, they are able to remove certain genes from the human body that are causing certain types of defense. Like, for example, conditions like Marfan syndrome. I'm sure you know Marfan syndrome, where there would be lens dislocations and heart problems and many other things because of genetic defects. These are inherited conditions. We've got to a point now where Marfan syndrome can be obliterated in the next few years if it becomes permissible for geneticists to intervene to that level. There are countries such as America, as developed as it is not allowing anything in gene therapy. You would know America was one of the last countries to accept in vitro fertilization because they felt that it was inhuman, that it was not acceptable. Britain, on the other hand, is the leader in accepting gene therapies. So many of the things that are happening, people who are in genetics in the US are beginning to migrate to countries like Britain and Japan, where gene therapy is actually being adopted by the day. So many of the syndromes that we know today, all those things that cause your retinitis pigmentosa, many other syndromes that we know that actually result in patients coming to optometry with various types of vision and eye problems, are actually being programmed out of the human being. We're moving towards a time where it is going to be possible to select the kind of child that you want. With those developments, of course, comes the ability, using genetics, to cut out those genes that cause short-sightedness, to cut out those genes that cause astigmatism, to cut out those genes that cause many of the problems that we know them, where we in optometry are in the forefront today. We would have been spending our years trying to manage how to deal with progressive myopia. Progressive myopia in no time will be edited out of the genes. If we do get to that point, where will the profession of optometry be? If we get to the point where I can choose the color of the iris of my children, that now I'm sick and tired of this dark brown one of Africans. I want my children to have green eyes. We're moving to a point where that is becoming possible. Genetics has advanced to an extent where unborn embryos can now have children that are unborn, and they themselves can have children, to a point that when those embryos are allowed to develop, a child would be born that is already a grandfather, because already out of their own cells, they have been used to create another human being. This is the point, which today can be argued in terms of ethics. And we can begin to argue and bring religion into it and bring everything else into it. But the world has proven years ago, and many, many times over, that the things that we find acceptable, unacceptable today, for whatever the reason, become an integral part of our lives as we move on. So, as a profession, we are actually facing serious threat. Not just from the technology as we spoke about it in terms of artificial intelligence and robotics and the advancement of machines to a point where they do not need us to operate them. But we're also threatened by biology itself. Because as a profession, we've never wanted to look that far. We find ourselves at a point now where we are going to have to look much further than we have preferred to look. And unless we do it, people who are not optometrists, people who are not in the profession, as it is already happening now, will be the ones to determine what happens to us with all the training that we took. I will give you an example. With the crisis that we face today in COVID-19, everybody is scrambling for safety. The assumption that we can make is that we as optometrists probably don't have much to do in alleviating the problems that are being faced during this pandemic. Strangely enough, eye shields are being sold today by everyone else but optometrists. People who work within the hospitals are selling eye shields for the protection of their eyes because the eyes are the most exposed. But where does optometry come in that equation? There's thousands and thousands and thousands of these things that are being sold. Where do we feature? Nowhere. And what is our challenge as far as those things are concerned? We never actually thought that we could find ourselves relevant when we have a national pandemic such as this one that is coming. We have never actually fashioned the skill that we have for it to become relevant in a crisis such as this one. You look at the advisory panel of the state president. It's composed of everybody else. Everybody else. Most people are there. It's a fairly big panel. But as you would have it, we are the forgotten bunch. We are the lot that never comes to mind because we have never made it a habit to put ourselves as a profession in the foreminds of anyone else that is talking about health. So, here we are moving forwards with these blind spots around us. And until we find ways and means of getting together as a profession, talking about that which we are facing going into the future, we are going to practice our profession into significance. The robots will take over. Artificial intelligence, instead of aiding us, will take over from us. And perhaps anyone in future who can afford to buy the machinery that is unmanned can basically open a practice because we would have got to the point where that has become the norm. So as I said in my opening statement, the unfortunate part about being who we are as optometrists and about being alive in general is the fact that we have to live our lives forwards, but everything that we learn is backwards because none of us have the ability to anticipate that which will come tomorrow. That, however, does not mean that we cannot be relevant. We can find a way of being relevant. Everybody is threatened by exactly the same things. The stethoscope is becoming obsolete in medicine because cell phones are taking over. People can check their blood saturation. They can check their heart rhythms. If you have an iPhone and a watch that sits on your wrist, it can tell you when your heart goes into a dysrhythmia and report to you that you need to go and see a doctor. So it is not just us. But the difference with other professions that I have seen, fortunately I happen to straddle across professions, is that there are conversations in those professions about how to stay relevant in the face of what is facing us. I am not too sure if those discussions are taking place in optometry. I hope that we will begin to prompt one another and accept the fact that the good old days are gone. They will never, ever come back. With that premise, we need to start talking about the future. And the more we can put our heads together, we will be able to unravel and find solutions in what seems to be threatening the total obliteration of our profession. So beware that we do not become dinosaurs within the healthcare professions simply because we have never actually ever taken the time to collaborate amongst ourselves and to collaborate when we look outside with other professions. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramela. I think that was indeed thought-provoking. I have noted a few things that you said, but one of the things that was interesting to me, and I think the profession and the colleagues out there have taken note of the same, is that redundancy is not an option. And unless we really start talking, we are going to be left behind. I have seen people talking about CPDs and all that. I think if people are concerned about CPDs, when we are talking about issues like this, then you have totally missed the point. I would like to invite questions on the chat, and Dr. Ramela would then engage, or if there are no questions, comments, where you'd like to engage Dr. Ramela. As he has indicated, it was very difficult for me to get him to come to this platform. So I imagine that after this, he's going to go back and hide wherever I found him. I'm not going to tell you where I found him, but I can assure you that he was hiding. So before he goes back to hiding, please engage him. Type your comments, questions on the chat, and then I will then read them out to Dr. Ramela. I see that people are saying much appreciation, thank you. And there was a comment that was made by Hasina Majid that I would like to read for you, Dr. Ramela, and maybe just your thoughts on that. Hasina says our curriculum and training needs to shift from refraction as the core, and we need to have some level of compulsory training and exposure to work in hospitals and clinics. Once we detach from the sale of consumables for sustainability and become dependent on our clinical skills, we will reshape how we practice. I wonder if you have any comments on that, Dr. Ramela.
No, that is actually very true, and that is something that I support. Fully. Because remember that as long as we bank on materials for our survival in the profession, we are going to be competing with some guy that is sitting in a garage in Russia who's got access to these things, who can actually sell things that within 24, 48 hours you can receive your spectacles. So we need to move away from that. And we need to be paid not so much for what we sell, but for the professional skill that we bring to the table. So we should be selling skills more than products, and leave the sale of products to those people who do not have the skills that we have. So until we value the skills, until we make sure that our skills become more pronounced and valuable, and not just valuable, but also relevant, we are going to find that our earnings are going to diminish as time proceeds.
Thank you. I see there was another comment earlier on by Patrick Mawila, who says, our internal threats are as bad. Imagine with the invention of external threats, we will be a shadow of a profession. Any comments on that?
I totally agree with that. The only unfortunate part about our internal threats is that we make them ourselves. Our internal threats are the easiest to deal with because we've got control over those things. We also have the ability to determine the pace in terms of when they get resolved and when they do not get resolved. The external threats, unfortunately, are completely out of our hands. And unless we hasten, they will change us instead of us find a way of changing those external threats.
Thank you. Then there's another comment by Sitole, who says, if optometry was to be included in the primary healthcare, definitely things would be done differently.
I agree also. I think that is 100% true. And if you actually try and see why is it that optometry is not included that much in primary healthcare, I mean, I think there's a lot that has been done to try and get optometry into primary healthcare. But the problem is that we have not actually supported those efforts as a profession. We sit and we watch those things happen. And every time it is always somebody else that is creating a problem except for us as the professionals. It's either it's the Health Professions Council, it's this or that other thing, but never us as the profession, because we have not actually as yet realized the type of damage that we're doing to ourselves as a profession in the process of trying to scurry for the crumbs under the table. When we should actually be claiming our place around the table to eat from that which sits on top of the table.
Thank you so much. There is a question from Mahomet Kasuji. I hope I pronounced your surname right. Mahomet says, Dr. Ramela, considering that you are involved in gene therapy on a broader scale, how would the cost of gene therapy affect accessibility in our country?
Yeah. If you look at the typing of the human genome, it used to take months to be able to put the codes of a person's genes and have it listed so that it can be read. It got down to a point where it started taking a few weeks to be able to get to that point. Now we are at a point where it takes 48 hours and less to read the complete human genome and to come up with a report in terms of what is happening. There are countries now where there are gene clinics where you can actually walk in on a Monday and come back on a Wednesday, and they can tell you that you are carrying this and that other and this other defective gene. So it has got to a point where technology has accelerated so much that all the time that was wasted, which made gene therapy so expensive, all that time has now been crushed down to about 48 hours and less. That the cost of actually running the test is probably now tantamount to the cost of owning that program and the cost of electricity. So whilst it is expensive because not too many people are doing it, but the more we begin to engage and we want to find out, the newer couples that are coming, before they get married might decide, listen, I don't know what I have in my genes. You don't know what you have. Let's go and get our genes read and let's see what dangers we're facing in terms of our kids. You can take a decision before then that it's a good idea for us to have kids, or it's not such a good idea for us to have kids. And in due course, you might actually find that reproduction is now a question of the test tube. And the issue of sex becomes a pastime, not necessarily for procreation, because procreation can then be typed in terms of the kinds of things that you want to avoid going into the future.
Thank you. There is a question here as well from Tobeki Lenyatigas, who says, how do you propose we remain relevant as a profession? What measures can we take given the restrictions that come with the, I think he says, legalities?
There are very few restrictions, actually, that come with legalities. I can give you a direct example of pharmacy. Pharmacy, before it became what we now know as pharmacy today, they were just like optometry. Nobody who was not a pharmacist could actually own a pharmacy practice. But they came together and decided that, listen, let's open this up to corporate ownership. Pharmacists themselves have got to a point now where they are actually opening small GP practices within the pharmacists themselves. And guess who's the doctor there? It's the pharmacist. Because remember, you can walk into a pharmacy and say to the pharmacist, listen, I've got a slight cough and this and that and the other thing. Now, Summer is actually fighting with the pharmacy council because they're saying, no, when someone has a sore throat, they must go and see a doctor. But that in itself may not be such forward thinking on the part of the doctors. So it is possible, highly, highly possible, that the profession can actually be transformed going forward. And the decisions whether to transform or not to transform is a decision of the profession. If we were to come together, it's the collaborations I was talking about in Blindspot number 3, that if we were to find strategic collaborations with other professions, we could actually find ourselves being far more relevant than with other people than we are by ourselves. We could actually be far more powerful as a profession if we collaborated more within the profession than we are doing at the moment. So it is crucial that we begin to look, that we introspect, but at the same time as introspecting, we need to look outside for relevance. And that there's hardly any legislation that stands in our way. If you look at the professional board for optometry and dispensing opticians, it is possible that a decision, just like we could decide in the past to say there's no need to practice in your own name, and you can now name your practice Bright Lights Vision. We took that decision. There was no legislation that said we can't take that decision. So we are where we are because of the kinds of decisions that we have taken within the professional board. And the professional board is not an isolated entity that stands there. It comprises of people that we are the people who choose who goes there. And those people come out of the professional board. They come back to be with us. So the issue of self-regulation, in as much as we downplay that and we say we're controlled by the professional board, no, it's actually us who run the professional board. So there's not much by way of legislation. The most of the legislation that exists, which holds the profession back, is where other professions are impacted. Then we begin to get those hurdles. For example, now the registration of the formulary for optometry. It has taken years. I remember in 2002 when I started the Department of Optometry at the Free State University. That matter was already on the table back then. We are in 2020 now, 18 years later. How far are we? And that arises because we have had problems with other professions. There have been hurdles that have been created because our collaboration with others outside of optometry has not been good either. There are historical differences that have been there, and those are the things that hold us back. But by ourselves and within ourselves, we have got the ability and the opportunity to determine what are the guidelines that we put in place. What are the things that we would like to see change in terms of legislation impacting on optometry or the regulatory function of the professional board vis-a-vis what we now call the fourth industrial revolution. How forward-looking is the professional board? Or are we keeping them looking backwards and yet expect us to move with speed collectively? And we can't. The regulatory body is there for a function. But remember, it is us in that regulatory body. So we can change the legislation if we want to. Question is, what do we change? And why do we change it? And how is it going to make a difference? Not just to us, but to everyone out there. And is it palatable with all the other professions? Those are the questions we should be answering.
Thank you. I have 4 more questions, and I see that 2 questions are very similar, one from Patrick Mawila and another one from Colin Leong. So I'll just read the 2 together, and then you can then answer them at the same time so that we also are cognizant of time. So the first question from Mawila says, while acknowledging that we need to start training the cadre fit for the future, what would you suggest for the current cadre sustenance? And from Colin Leon, it says, greeting Pax, how do you see us becoming more relevant versus the other professions? And I think those 2 are similar. If you can take those 2.
Yeah. Look, strategically, one of the most important things that we can do is to align ourselves with the principles of universal healthcare. We are going to find it extremely difficult to continue to survive with this. How many percent is within the is currently covered by medical aids? 12, 14, maybe 16% at the most. And I mean, I know that is it's an exaggeration, but those numbers have been stagnant. Medical aids, the number of medical aids has now gone down below 100. And after this COVID crisis, there are medical aids that are marginal in terms of their liquidity. Those medical aids will probably be swallowed up by the other bigger medical schemes that have got liquidity. In the process of that happening, there are people that are not going to be members of medical schemes. And if we are looking for a solution for survival, why are we looking at this shrinking pot, which is going to continue to shrink going forward? Instead, why are we not finding ways to look outside of this pot, come up with creative ways in which we can make our service purchasable, but the product a lot cheaper than it is at the moment?
Thank you. There's a question from Tapelo Kungwan who says, while clinical proficiency is imperative, there is very little reward and recognition for it. I think it's more a comment. Do you have any comments on that, Dr. Ramela?
Yeah, look, if we ourselves don't place much importance on our clinical skill and clinical acumen, we should not be surprised when other people don't pay too much attention to that. It starts with us. If we were the ones that really held ourselves high in terms of our clinical abilities and clinical acumen and what we can and cannot contribute, and educated other professions as to what is it that we can put on the table, why are we surprised when the GP doesn't think it is necessary to take a 3-year-old child whose mother is complaining that I think this child has a squint, to say, no, take that child to an optometrist? They will probably only say, no, take the child to an ophthalmologist. It is us who must make ourselves relevant. And if we are not relevant, it means that we have not been doing our marketing as a profession well enough. So the responsibility starts with us. So before we start pointing fingers at other people and pointing fingers at every other profession, it is us who must make ourselves relevant. And when that value has been created internally, it is going to be so much easier for other people to accept it. Because in the process, we will not just be retraining ourselves and making ourselves relevant. We are going to be teaching the other professions about what is it that we can and cannot do.
Thank you. There's another question that says, Dr. Pax, what effect will it be by increasing our scope? Okay, I think there's a typo here, but in essence, it's saying that by increasing optometry to a 5-year degree. I'm not sure if you want to take that one.
Yeah. I'm not too sure if I want to answer that question, because I think there are merits into doing that. My biggest challenge about optometry is the fact that the profession is too flat. It is just too flat. And unfortunately, we are paying the price for it.
Yes, thank you. And I think I'm going to take this as a last question. Let me just see. But let me read it for you and I'll just screen if there's any other question. It says, with the example of pharmacy cited by Dr. Pax Ramela, does he view corporate ownership as a benefit or a threat to optometry?
That is an extremely difficult question to answer. If you ask me as a person whether I think that is something that I would fall for, no, I don't think so. I do not see the benefits of corporate ownership anywhere. If you look at what has happened in pharmacy, literally the community pharmacist has been obliterated from the face of the earth. Everyone now goes to Discam. Everyone goes to, what's this other thing? Clicks. We go to ShopRite checkers for our prescriptions. What has happened to the community pharmacists that would be able to sit within the community, understand their needs, and be able to recognize their problem in time to advise the doctor that, listen, this one is not doing well on this, that one is not doing well on this. So I have my reservations with corporate ownership. It is not something that I can be able to advocate with a clean conscience, not because I am fearful of the corporate world per se, but because I have not actually seen the benefits that much. The benefits of corporate ownership tend to benefit those people who can afford. But what about those who cannot afford? They are just simply shut out. And unfortunately, with corporate ownership comes gentrification. The pharmacy, as we know, the pharmacy outlet, as we know it, sells many other things other than medicines. Now, when you take a Discam or a what do you call this other thing, a Clicks, and you put it in the middle of the township, what about all these other products that could have been sold at the spaza shop at the corner there? We are literally obliterating those businesses as well. Even if they do not sell medicines, but they will feel the impact of having a corporate entity such as that one, that masquerades its service as a pharmaceutical outlet or a pharmacy outlet, when at the same time, it is competing with the spaza shop owner with a cheaper chomp, a cheaper Coke, and a cheaper this and a cheaper that. That spaza shop is going to close before we know it. Because sooner rather than later, people are going to gravitate towards the cheaper prices. So I have my reservations with corporate ownership. And perhaps I may actually have to be convinced by a more clever argument as to why that would actually be a good decision for optometry. But I'm very fearful of it. If you look lastly at the people who advocate for corporate ownership of optometry in South Africa, go to their countries of origin. They are not involved with corporate ownership there. They are keeping optometry in their own countries, in the hands of the professionals. And when they come out to us, they try and tell us how good corporate ownership would be for the profession. I find it hard to swallow that pill.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, when I invited Dr. Ramela, I had promised him that it will not take more than an hour. I see that we have spent an hour and 4 minutes on this session. And on that note, I would like us to end it here. I recognize some of the comments that have been made, and I just take them as comments. For example, Randy says, we have to educate the society to see us beyond medical aid benefits. I see there's issues about what is happening in Nigeria and so forth. And I know that all of you can read those comments. So I appreciate the comments. And I also would like to say thank you so much to Dr. Ramela for a very thought-provoking talk. As you promised, you did not disappoint in my view. and for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and share with us your thought-provoking ideas. I sincerely thank you. And lastly, to thank all of you for joining us on this webinar and staying the course. I hope that the talk will not just end here, and then we can then go and make efforts in our corners to come together as optometrists to really start putting our heads together to finding solutions. And on that note, thank you so much, Dr. Ramela. I don't know if you have any last comments. Thank you.
No, thank you for the opportunity to talk to everyone, and thanks for everyone who logged into the webinar. I think we probably need to do this more often than we are actually doing. So my heartfelt gratitude to everyone who took the time to listen. Thank you.